Remember the 5th of November, Gunpowder, Treason and Plot. I see no reason why gunpowder or treason should ever be forgot. Do you ever wonder where that story came from, that poem? Whatever it is, why should we remember? And what is gunpowder and treason anyway? This is Guy Fawkes night. It's a party. We all have fun. We have fireworks. We have bonfires. Let's just enjoy it. Maybe I should just tell you why we have this party, why we have all this fun. Well, we'll have to go back a while to England in 1604. In May 1604, England had a new Protestant king. He was James I, also known as James VI in Scotland. He had come down from Scotland after the death of Elizabeth I a couple of years earlier and had become king, and he was king with a great deal of hope originally. Britain was divided, and under his reign the unification of England and Scotland seemed a real event, and that is when England and Scotland became known as the United Kingdom. Then, as the first years of his reign progressed, dissent in the population in England started to increase. Many of the English had been long-time Roman Catholics, and James was a Protestant, as Elizabeth had been before him. And many religious wars were still raging across Europe, where Roman Catholics and Protestants fought bitter and bloody wars. Many Englishmen had just come back from fighting in the Netherlands and Flanders, which had just been in a bitter struggle against the Catholic kings in Spain, which had attempted to maintain rule over them. Among these men was a man named Guy Fawkes. He was an Englishman from Yorkshire in the north of England, and he had gone over to the Netherlands to fight for the Catholic cause, to maintain Catholic rule in the Protestant Netherlands. And over in the Netherlands, he had learned about explosives and gunpowder. And on his return to England, he found an England that had returned to the dark days of anti-Catholic feeling. Laws were passed where Catholics were now no longer allowed to go to school. Catholics could not own businesses. Catholics could not become high officials within the court. And so men like Fawkes found it hard to actually survive. Also amongst the wealthy landowners in England was a man named Robert Catesby. Now, Robert Catesby had not fought in any wars. He had been, his family had been relatively wealthy during the 1500s and made money from farming and being merchants and general trade. Catesby's family had lost a lot of their money during the persecutions of the Catholics towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, and as such he joined several groups of Catholics which plotted to overthrow Elizabeth and put on the throne a Catholic monarch. With the death of Elizabeth in 1602, Catesby, like many other Catholics, had rejoiced that James was going to come and become James I of England. He himself had married a Catholic, and it looked as though Catholics were going to be able to regain some of their former power within the English court. But after a few months, it became clear that James was just as hardline as Elizabeth had been, and was not going to allow Catholics any freedom. So by May 1604, Catesby had come up with a plan, and a daring plan. He would make a group of people. They would then take the law into their own hands and actually blow up the Parliament with the King and all the court, all the lords and judges and bishops assembled on the first night, the opening night of a great Parliament. It was originally planned that the attack would happen by the end of 1604, but as was the case in many old medieval cities like London at the beginning of the 17th century, there was plague in the city and the Parliament itself was cancelled. Now this allowed the members of the group to conspire together for longer. Among the men who worked with Catesby was Thomas Percy. He was the son of the Duke of Northumberland and a major member of the House of Lords. And with Percy came Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was brought in because of his wartime experience and his use of explosives. And during the May meeting of 1604, Catesby and his friend Sir Thomas Percy and Guy Fawkes came up with a plan. At the time, the Houses of Parliament, which were not like the modern day Parliament, where they are set in large gardens on the banks of the Thames, the Houses of Parliament of the medieval period were a ramshackle group of houses surrounded by wine merchants and bakers' shops and other houses with lodgings, and the Great Hall of the Palace of Westminster was in the centre of a huge complex of buildings. Luckily for the plotters at this time, a baker's shop right next to the Great Hall was allowed to be let, and Sir Thomas Percy stepped in straight away and bought the lease on the property. The idea was not to actually set up as a baker's shop. The idea was that they would tunnel then from the basement under the baker's shop across a couple of buildings between them and the Great Hall of the Palace of Westminster, and then under the Palace of Westminster they would build a cave which would then be filled with explosives, and this would then on the occasion be blown up with the lords and the kings and everyone assembled in the palace above them. During the late summer of 1604, progress was made as the men tunnelled and dug their way under the buildings. Then, a stroke of luck, Sir Thomas Percy was made a member of the King's own bodyguard, a great step forward since Percy was a known Catholic sympathiser, and it was good news because now Percy and his staff could have full access to the Palace of Westminster. Among them was a man named John Johnson. Now, not to confuse you, but John Johnson was actually Guy Fawkes. He took the name of Johnson and became the valet of Sir Thomas Percy, and then rented a small part of the cellar under the palace, the Great Hall of the Palace of Westminster itself. Now, Johnson, being a servant of a member of the Royal Bodyguard, was then allowed full access to the cellars of the Parliament building, and slowly but surely barrels of gunpowder were moved from Robert Catesby's home across the river in Lambeth, rowed across the River Thames to Westminster, where they were moved down under the Palace of Westminster itself, and as time went on, they actually managed to get 36 barrels of gunpowder under the Palace of Westminster. Now, to equate that, it depends on what actual measure the barrels were, but that would be the equivalent of about 1 to 3 tons of explosives under the building. And the building itself was not very big, and so 3 tons of explosives could easily destroy the whole building itself and everyone inside it. Now, by 1605, the plotters had managed to gain access to the Palace of Westminster. They had begun to set barrels of gunpowder under the palace itself, and then they had also managed to spread the word amongst other Catholic plotters. So by the summer of 1605, the band of plotters had grown from 3 to over 12 men. And of course, by the time people start to hear about things, rumours spread, and people can't always keep secrets. So it was no surprise that, again, the Parliament was cancelled. So the Parliament moved from the end of the summer, was put back 2 months to November of 1605, with the official opening date going to be on the 5th of November. By now, the conspirators had also started to work amongst their friends out in the more provincial districts of England. Catholicism was still a major religion, and many Catholics, though secretively they were looking for a more improved access to power, they also worried that any problems which the conspiracy caused would come back with a vengeance on them. So as Catesby and Percy moved among their friends, they tried to get them to step forward as supporters for the conspiracy to replace the monarch, and also to arrange to raise militias who would then, if need be, fight the armies of the king or whoever stepped into the power vacuum left after the destruction of Parliament. It was at this time that Guy Fawkes went off then back to Flanders. He spent the summer going around meeting his old friends, and messages started then to come back from spies in Flanders that there was a man using the name of Guido Fawkes, an Englishman who was obviously up to no good and was looking very suspicious to the agents of the British Crown. Guy Fawkes did not know about this, but then with the notice that the Parliament would return, he returned to England in October of 1605 and checked on the explosives under the Houses of Parliament. And it may be that the explosives may not have actually been in good condition. We will never know, but they were still safe. They were in their barrels underneath the Parliament where they had been left, hidden under bushels of firewood. Catesby and Percy then took up their positions and maintained their lives outside of London itself. They didn't want to look suspicious to anyone and just made it look as though they were going about their normal business. In October 1605, on October the 26th, a mysterious man went to the house of Lord Monteagle. Now, Lord Monteagle had been a prestigious Catholic, but he had changed to become an Anglican or Protestant. And the man delivered into the hands of Monteagle's servant a letter. Now this letter has gone down as being infamous. In the letter, Monteagle was advised that at the occasion of the opening of Parliament, that he should not attend because there would be a decisive blow given and the people there would not see who had delivered the blow. Monteagle immediately called for his horse and rode to the offices of Sir Robert Cecil, the head of the English Secret Service at the time. Now Cecil was a shrewd man and he put this letter into his pocket, and to all intents and purposes he forgot about the letter. He made no move that would indicate that he knew that something was going on, but waited and waited. And then he heard reports of the movements of Guy Fawkes coming back from the Netherlands, and also other Catholics were seeming to act rather strangely. By November the 1st, Cecil had decided that the time had come to act. So he went to King James and offered him the letter and said that he didn't understand what it was. Now James, since a child, he had suffered several assassination attempts. His own father had been blown up by his allies of his mother. James had a terror of being blown up. He read the letter and saw the words that a blow would be delivered and came to the conclusion almost immediately that Parliament was going to be blown up. At this moment, Cecil knew his time had come to strike. Cecil allowed the king to come to the conclusion that he wanted and ordered that the Parliament should be searched by soldiers in the afternoon of November the 4th. And initially the soldiers went down, searched under the Parliament buildings, and there they met a man named John Johnson. And Johnson spoke to the guards and was happy enough to speak with them, didn't seem nervous at all, and explained how he was a servant of Sir Thomas Percy and how he was just checking the firewood for the coming winter in the cellars. And so the guards moved on and went back up into the Palace of Westminster again, and there the king was told that there was nothing to worry about. There was nothing in the cellars of the Parliament which needed to be considered as a threat. James, however, was not so easily convinced, and he ordered that the men then return back down into the cellars shortly before midnight on the 4th of November. There again, they came across John Johnson. He was already booted and spurred and ready to take horse, and he was waiting with a candle and a match and just waiting in order to bide the time for Parliament to open the next day. This time, though, the soldiers were not so quite charmed by Johnson's behaviour and started to move away the firewood from under the cellar, and then began to uncover not one but 36 barrels of gunpowder. Johnson was immediately arrested and taken away and held in the palace till the next morning, when he was taken to James, and James asked him what was he doing with the gunpowder under the Parliament. And Fawkes is alleged to have said, "I wanted to blow you back to your mountains in Scotland." And with this, James ordered Johnson to be taken away and put to the test to see if he was telling the truth. Johnson was taken then to the Tower of London, and on November the 6th, King James ordered that Johnson be taken to the Tower, and there gave the governor of the Tower licence to put Johnson to torture. Initially, the torture was to be the mildest form. He would be suspended by his hands from a chain on the walls, and they're left to hang for several hours until he hopefully would give up what he knew. But Fawkes was made of stronger stuff, and so it was decided that stronger methods would be needed. And so Fawkes was then put to the rack. Now, the rack was one of the most terrible of all torture instruments. Ropes would be tied around the man's ankles and his wrists, and he would be placed on a table, and a system of pulleys and levers would then be used to pull on each of the ropes. And as the ropes pulled and pulled and pulled, then the man would be stretched, and each joint, from the elbow to the shoulder, the hip, the knee, the ankle, would each be pulled out and stretched at each point. And then, if the person hadn't already suffered shock and possibly even died, the chances are that they would be crippled for the rest of their lives. Outside London, the Catesby and Percy were making a run for the north. Along the way, they had called on their friends and fellow Catholics who they hoped would be there to support them, to raise an Catholic army which would then march into London and overthrow the forces which had been brought into power to replace the king and his parliament. But as they've moved further and further north, they found that their friends were less and less willing to be able to support them. And eventually they came to Staffordshire, which is on the English and Welsh borders in the far north of the Midlands. Having reached Staffordshire, the horses were tired and they were frustrated, and the men went to hide in a roadside inn, where eventually a group of militia and the local sheriff turned up, and a gunfight ensued. Gunfights were not a normal thing in England, though guns were fairly common and they were well-known instruments by that time. Guns were not accurate, but in the firefight that came about, both Percy and Catesby were duly executed, and the militiamen were released to go back home and received a pension for their efforts that day. Back in London, things were still going badly for Fawkes. By the end of November the 7th, he had been put to the rack and had already given up his true identity. Now the forces of the law knew that Fawkes was Guy Fawkes, the same Guido Fawkes who they'd known about from his adventures in the Netherlands. And as time went on, he was told about the failure of Catesby and Percy to raise an army to come to his rescue. And at some time within the next few days, it's not sure exactly when, Fawkes gave up the names of some of the other conspirators, and they too were arrested and taken to the Tower, some of whom were put to torture as well. Others were not so eager to face the punishments and were quite glad to give up names of their fellow conspirators. By the end of the year, Fawkes had been tried and sentenced for high treason. And the punishment for high treason in England during the 17th century was to be hung, drawn and quartered. And hung, drawing and quartering was not the most pleasant way to die. It was not quick, it was very, very slow. The man who was your executioner could delay your death for as long as he wished. If he wanted to create pain, the more the better, as far as the officials were concerned. Being hung, drawn and quartered was not meant to just punish, it was meant to deter, to say, if you dare to bring treason to this land, then this will be your punishment. And so, on the morning of their execution, Fawkes and several others were taken from their prison cells. Some were taken to St. Paul's churchyard and executed on the steps of the old St. Paul's Cathedral. Fawkes and 4 others were taken down to the Palace of Westminster, to the Great Hall where they had plotted to be blown up. And then, one by one, they were taken up to the gallows. Each man was made to climb a ladder up to a noose which was placed around their neck. They then were allowed to hang. If they were lucky, the executioner may feel sorry for them or may have been ordered to show them leniency. And they would be allowed, those men were allowed to hang for longer, maybe up to 5 or 10 minutes, making sure that they were unconscious or maybe even dead. By the time they were cut down, then their bellies were cut open, their entrails pulled out and put into a brazier, a burning box of coals, and as their intestines burned, the men would be forced to watch and smell their own bodies burning. Finally, they would then be laid out, their arms and legs stretched apart, and each limb would be severed at the main joint, arms at the shoulders, legs at the hip. And even then, death was not guaranteed. The men may still be suffering from shock and be in pain and still screaming, as finally they were beheaded. Fawkes, however, was one of the lucky ones. He climbed to the top of the ladder at the gallows, still weak from his injuries. His limbs were smashed by the rack, the joints would not work, and he put his head in the noose and fell. The fall instantly broke his neck and he died before he had a chance to hang. He was then cut down and his entrails cut out and burned and his limbs severed, and he was finally beheaded. Then, after the bodies were taken down from the gallows, their heads were then taken to London Bridge, where they were put on pikes, large, long spears, and put on the bridge, which was a main entrance into the city of London. And it was kept there as a warning. If you want to bring treason to this land, then this will be your payment. Death, a horrible death. So there, that is how we now have Guy Fawkes Night. A year later, in 1606, King James ordered that a great feast be set up, and that every year on the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, people would be allowed to celebrate the victory over the plotters. At the time, many bonfires actually carried two figures, Fawkes and another effigy of the Pope. That has now faded into obscurity, and now at any party you will often see the guy sat alone on top of the bonfire as he burns, and as people stand around enjoying a party which has little more meaning than a tailgate party at a football match. So with that in mind, it's time now to go back and enjoy our party at the bonfire. And this is William Elliott saying thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this history of what is Guy Fawkes Night.